In recent months, the relationship between King Charles and Queen Camilla has shown growing signs of strain, sparking whispers throughout the royal circles and beyond. Once presented as a steadfast couple who had weathered decades of scandal, betrayal, and public disapproval to finally stand united, the cracks now appear more visible than ever. Sources close to the palace suggest that behind the gilded doors, their private exchanges have become increasingly tense, often boiling into moments of sharp disagreement. The breaking point, according to insiders, came during a closed-door family meeting where King Charles allegedly made a shocking move that no one could have foreseen. He is said to have stripped Camilla of her royal title in front of senior members of the House of Windsor, a decision that sent tremors through the very foundation of the monarchy. This act was not just symbolic, but a clear demonstration of power and frustration, hinting at the depth of discord that has long been simmering beneath the surface. For years, Camilla has worked to solidify her place within the royal family, fighting off waves of criticism and suspicion from the public who still hold memories of Princess Diana close to heart. Yet, this latest development suggests that her position may not be as secure as it once seemed. Was this a moment of heated impulse from the king, or the culmination of a long-brewing conflict that even the crown itself could not conceal? In the quiet halls of Windsor, a family meeting meant for unity became the most explosive moment in modern royal history when King Charles looked his wife in the eye and stripped her of her royal title in front of everyone. The gathering had been announced to only a handful of senior royals, a supposed moment of reflection and togetherness meant to reinforce stability during fragile times. Yet behind the polished announcement and the hushed invitations, something darker simmered. The atmosphere was charged, the air thick with suspicion, as though each person walking into that room carried an unspoken awareness that tonight would be unlike any other. Charles himself looked frail, his shoulders slightly bowed from the weight of age and illness, but his eyes betrayed none of the weakness that lingered in his body. They were sharp, unflinching, and steady. There was a determination there, one that seemed almost out of place for a man so often portrayed as indecisive. He sat in silence for several long minutes before anyone dared speak. His very presence commanded the room in a way that silenced every cough, every shuffle of feet. Camilla entered with her usual blend of confidence and calculation. Her presence was commanding in its own right. She believed she was walking into a meeting designed to further cement her role within the monarchy. To her mind, this was the next step in establishing her permanence as queen consort, the rightful partner by Charles's side. The faint smile she carried suggested that she expected support, deference, and perhaps even celebration. What she could not see, or perhaps refused to see, was the storm that had already gathered around her throne. William and Catherine followed closely behind, their steps synchronized, their expressions carved from stone. They exchanged no words with Camilla, offered no gestures of acknowledgement. Yet their silence was its own statement. Their eyes darted to Charles, then back to one another, as though communicating something in a language beyond words. They knew they had been preparing for this moment in their own way, watching the balance of power shift, waiting for the final act to play itself out. And then there was Princess Anne, seated near the head of the table. Her face was unreadable, her eyes betraying nothing but an iron calm. To those who knew her best, her composure was revealing in itself. It was the kind of stillness that came not from ignorance, but from certainty. Anne had always been the guardian of duty, the quiet enforcer of the crown's traditions, and on this night her silence hinted that she had already seen the script of what was to come. The moment hung in the air like a pendulum waiting to drop. Conversations died before they began, and the sense of anticipation grew unbearable. Charles cleared his throat, an ordinary sound, yet one that struck the room like a thunderclap. Every head turned. Camilla's smile faltered ever so slightly. William's jaw tightened. Catherine lowered her eyes, but the faintest flicker of satisfaction touched her lips. Anne sat unmoving, her eyes locked firmly on her brother, as if daring him to follow through. And then, with words that no one in that room ever believed they would hear, Charles spoke. His voice trembled only once, but it carried the weight of finality. In a tone that brooked no argument, he declared that Camilla would no longer carry the royal title she had worn into that room. The silence that followed was deafening, a silence filled not with peace, but with the roar of everything left unsaid. Gasps escaped. Camilla's hand clutched the table as though to anchor herself, and William's eyes flashed toward his father with both shock and a strange sense of inevitability. It was not a decision spoken lightly, nor was it one that could be reversed. In that moment, the illusion shattered, and every hidden fracture within the family came rushing to the surface. Charles's frailty no longer mattered. His voice, his resolve, his authority, all of it reigned supreme as he delivered the blow. For Camilla, it was humiliation. For William and Catherine, it was vindication. And for Anne, it was the confirmation of a truth long awaited. But what led to this extraordinary moment wasn't born in a single meeting. It was decades of suspicion, hidden conflicts, and secret decisions now crashing into the open. What looked like a polished royal marriage was quietly collapsing behind palace walls. And insiders say Charles had been preparing for this day, long before Camilla even realized. The cracks did not appear suddenly. They grew slowly, almost invisibly, hidden behind ceremonies, polite smiles, and rehearsed words. From the outside, the king and queen consorts seemed united. But within the inner circles of the palace, there was a persistent sense of unease. Those closest to Charles began to notice that his patience with Camilla's influence was wearing thin. A patience already fragile from the immense pressures of the throne. Each disagreement, each private quarrel, was another stone added to a wall that threatened to divide the monarchy at its very core. The earliest signs emerged soon after Charles's ascension. Camilla, once celebrated for her resilience and ability to navigate public opinion, began to overstep in ways Charles could no longer ignore. Small disputes over ceremonial roles, who should take precedence at key events, or how certain protocols were managed, quickly escalated into a battle of wills. While Charles clung tightly to tradition, Camilla leaned toward asserting her authority, demanding recognition that exceeded her title. These subtle power struggles, invisible to the public, left Charles increasingly uneasy, for he knew that once protocol was bent, the very fabric of monarchy could begin to unravel. Adding to the strain was Camilla's growing insistence on involving her family in matters that Charles believed should remain sacred to the crown. Her children and extended relatives began to circle closer to the heart of royal life, appearing in spaces once carefully guarded for the Windsor bloodline alone. To Charles, it was not merely a family blending. It was encroachment. The whispers in corridors grew louder. Was Camilla building a legacy not for the monarchy, but for her own bloodline? Each suggestion of her family stepping into roles traditionally reserved for royals left Charles feeling cornered, betrayed, and alarmed. The situation worsened when Camilla's reach into royal charities began drawing scrutiny. What began as noble intentions soon transformed into accusations of overreach. Trustees and long-standing royal patrons began to quietly complain that Camilla was redirecting influence and resources in ways that placed her name and interests above the crown itself. Though the public never saw the storm inside the palace, these tensions were boiling with Charles caught between protecting the institution and preserving his marriage. For the king, who had endured a lifetime of personal battles, the idea of his reign being overshadowed by whispers of Camilla's ambition was intolerable. Then came the tension with Catherine, a quiet but pivotal force. Unlike Camilla, Catherine understood the delicate balance between tradition and modernity, and she sensed that the public's tolerance for Camilla was far thinner than anyone in the palace admitted. In private, she reportedly warned Charles that the queen consort's increasing assertiveness would invite backlash, reopening wounds that Diana's memory had never allowed to fully heal. Charles listened, torn between his loyalty to his wife and the undeniable truth that Catherine represented the monarchy's future. Catherine's words lingered, echoing in Charles's mind as a reminder that to safeguard the crown, he might have to make the most painful choice of all. William's began to draw back, subtle but telling. He distanced himself from Camilla's initiatives, attending fewer of her engagements and speaking less publicly in her support. To many, it looked like nothing more than scheduling conflicts. To those behind the scenes, it was a deliberate act. William understood that aligning himself too closely with Camilla risked alienating a public that saw Catherine as the rightful standard-bearer of the monarchy. Every quiet withdrawal, every absence was another step in shifting the balance of power toward his side of the family. Charles noticed, and the message was clear. His heir would not tie himself to Camilla's fate, and all the while, Princess Anne remained steadfast in her skepticism. Though never publicly hostile, her silence spoke volumes. She had never fully accepted Camilla's position, and her guarded demeanor reinforced the sense that Charles was standing on unstable ground. To Anne, loyalty to the crown was absolute, and anyone who threatened its purity was a danger, no matter how close they stood to the throne. Her disapproval became another shadow in the room, reminding Charles that even within his own bloodline, Camilla would never command unquestioned respect. Together, these cracks formed a chasm. What had once looked like unity was now a facade, and Charles knew it. Each confrontation, each whispered warning, each subtle withdrawal from his children and sister painted the picture of a monarchy divided. For Charles, the realization grew undeniable. If he failed to act, the crown itself would pay the price. But the private cracks weren't the only issue. The monarchy itself was in danger of splitting in two, and Charles knew he had to act before it was too late. Outside the gilded palace gates, the public mood was turning, and Charles realized the very survival of the crown could depend on removing the woman once meant to steady it. What had begun as quiet murmurs of disapproval grew into an unmistakable roar, echoing through newspapers, television panels, and across countless dinner tables. The monarchy had long lived and died by public sentiment. And though Charles had endured decades of scrutiny, the venom now directed toward Camilla was unlike anything he had anticipated. Each appearance she made, each speech she delivered seemed to deepen the resentment instead of healing it. Crowds that once politely applauded now fell into uncomfortable silence, their skepticism impossible to mask. For a monarchy that thrived on ceremony and unity, such silence was more dangerous than protest. It was indifference, and indifference was fatal. The media, ever hungry for blood, sharpened their knives. Reports began to circle, not only about Camilla herself, but about the people closest to her. Her family's wealth, their business wise, and their perceived attempts to ride on the coattails of her royal status dominated headlines. Journalists unearthed old connections, questioned motives, and painted a picture of a queen consort less concerned with duty and more with power. Each article chipped away at her image. And though the palace attempted to manage the storm, it was clear that the tide was against her. For every smiling photograph released, there were twice as many accusations waiting to strike. Charles saw the damage, and he understood that once trust was broken, it was almost impossible to reclaim. Adding to the fire were the whispers of discord between Camilla and Catherine. Leaks from within the palace painted stories of heated words exchanged, of Camilla attempting to exert authority over matters Catherine had carefully nurtured. Whether true or exaggerated, the stories spread like wildfire, feeding a public eager for drama. The contrast between the two women was too stark to ignore. Catherine, graceful and reserved, embodied the future of the monarchy. Camilla, burdened by history, was accused of clinging to a crown that was never truly hers. Each headline became another weapon in the arsenal of public discontent, and Charles knew the comparison was impossible to control. And then came the ghost who had never truly left. the shadow of Princess Diana. Decades after her death, her memory burned brighter than ever, and with each passing year, her story gained new weight. For many, Camilla would always be the woman who had displaced Diana, the rival who had stepped into shoes that were never meant for her. Every image of Diana in the press was placed beside one of Camilla, and the contrast was merciless. Diana symbolized compassion, tragedy, and sacrifice. Camilla, in the public imagination, symbolized scandal, survival, and ambition. The weight of that comparison became unbearable, not just for Camilla, but for Charles, who watched the legacy of the woman he once loved resurface to haunt the reign he had only just begun. The unease reached the corridors of Parliament, where whispers of concern grew louder. Insiders began to quietly question whether Camilla's presence was harming the monarchy's stability rather than reinforcing it. Politicians who once offered unwavering respect to the king now trod carefully, hinting that reforms, or worse, interventions might become necessary if the crown continued to lose its grip on public trust. For Charles, it was more than political discomfort. It was a warning shot. When Parliament began to murmur, the throne itself trembled. Even abroad, there was disquiet. Reports filtered back to Charles that certain donors, allies, and even foreign dignitaries were beginning to question Camilla's suitability as a figurehead. Some privately expressed hesitation about associating too closely with her during state visits, fearing that her image would tarnish their own reputations. The monarchy's influence had always extended beyond Britain, shaping diplomatic ties across the globe. To hear whispers that even allies were second-guessing their association was a sign Charles could not ignore. The crown was not only a domestic institution, it was a symbol of power recognized worldwide. And now it was in jeopardy. The weight of all these forces, public discontent, media exposés, parliamentary whispers, and international unease pressed heavily on Charles's shoulders. What he had once seen as a personal struggle within his marriage had transformed into a battle for the very survival of the crown. Every day he delayed. The anger outside grew louder, the suspicion deeper, and the cracks wider. It was no longer a question of if he would act, but when. But what truly forced Charles's hand wasn't public opinion. It was the explosive secret revealed inside his own home. When Charles uncovered the truth about what Camilla had been planning in secret, he realized her crown wasn't just in danger, so was the monarchy itself. It began with whispers, faint traces of meetings that should never have taken place, and names that did not belong in the corridors of power. Advisors who had no official role were suddenly present in private gatherings, their influence seeping into spaces reserved only for the sovereign's trusted circle. Charles, who had spent a lifetime guarding the crown against manipulation, could not ignore what was unfolding. The queen consort was engaging with outsiders, and the nature of those conversations was far from innocent. They were not about charity or ceremonial duties. They were about power, legacy, and a future that placed her family above the royal bloodline itself. The most shocking discovery came in the form of a draft speech. It was never delivered publicly, but its very existence sent shivers through Charles's core. Written in careful language, it positioned Camilla not simply as a consort, but as a central force within the monarchy, while elevating her own family as figures deserving of recognition and prominence. It was a direct challenge to the sanctity of succession, one that sought to weave her bloodline into the very fabric of the monarchy's story. For Charles, it was a betrayal more profound than any personal quarrel. It was a rewriting of history in which his name and his reign were being co-opted for purposes he had never approved. His fury erupted when he discovered documents stamped with his name, signatures implied where none had been given. These were not clerical oversights. They were calculated moves, attempts to project authority without his sanction. To the king, it was more than an insult. It was treasonous in spirit, if not in law. He felt the monarchy being pulled away from his grasp, reshaped by hands that had no rightful claim to its throne. The quiet confidence Camilla displayed in recent weeks suddenly revealed itself as something else entirely. The confidence of a woman building her own empire within his crowns. It was Princess Anne who forced the matter fully into the open. Loyal, unyielding, and unwilling to see her mother's legacy tarnished, she reportedly brought the evidence to Charles with a bluntness only she could wield. Documents, testimonies, whispers from staff, all laid out before him like the final pieces of a puzzle he had been avoiding. Anne's message was clear. Camilla was stepping beyond her role, and if he did not act, the monarchy would bear scars that might never heal. The confrontation between brother and sister was tense, but in Anne's sharp words, Charles found the clarity he had been searching for. In the weeks that followed, his conversations with William grew increasingly heavy. Father and son sat together, sometimes in silence, sometimes in the fierce debate, wrestling with the reality of what Camilla's actions meant. William urged caution, but also pressed the truth that the monarchy's survival depended on drawing a line. They spoke of Diana, of legacy, of the fragile trust of a nation that could not endure another betrayal. For Charles, these exchanges cemented the decision that had already been forming. He would have to act, not in whispers, not in private corrections, but with a gesture so powerful it would silence the doubt forever. By the time the family meeting was called, the decision was no longer in question. Charles knew the price would be devastating, both personally and publicly. But in his mind, the alternative was worse. Camilla had crossed into a realm no consort should ever enter, threatening to reshape the crown for her own gain. Only a decisive act, brutal in its clarity, could restore order to a monarchy unraveling under the weight of secrets. And so the stage was set not for a gentle conversation, but for a brutal family reckoning. In a moment that froze the room, Charles's voice cracked through centuries of tradition as he declared Camilla would no longer carry the royal title she once fought to claim. The silence before his words was unbearable, stretched so thin that even the faintest sound would have shattered it. Every royal eye was fixed on him, searching for the meaning behind the pause, the weight of his hesitation. He held their attention like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, and all of them, even Camilla herself, sensed the plunge was near. Charles's hands trembled slightly as he held the document sealed with the royal crest, the symbol of absolute authority. It was not just paper. It was the embodiment of centuries of power, a reminder that his word carried the force of law. The weight of the crown pressed upon him in that instant, yet his resolve cut through his frailty. The sight of his trembling hands only made the room lean closer, for everyone present knew that this was not weakness, but the gravity of an act that could never be undone. Camilla's expression, so carefully maintained, faltered as he spoke. A smile had lingered at the corners of her mouth when she first sat down, a quiet signal of confidence, as if she believed the meeting would end in yet another confirmation of her position. But the moment the words struck her ears, the smile collapsed into disbelief. She stared at Charles, waiting for him to retract, to soften, to turn the declaration into a mistake. But he did not. His voice, though shaken with emotion, carried a finality that stripped away any hope of reversal. Across the table, William's reaction was restrained, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the storm beneath. His lips pressed tight, his eyes flickering toward Catherine, who sat poised and silent beside him. She met his glance with calm, a serenity that contrasted sharply with the chaos unraveling before them. William's restraint was deliberate, his silence a choice, for he knew that in this battle, the less he revealed, the stronger his position became. The room may have been Charles's stage, but William and Catherine's quiet presence told its own story that the future of the crown had already shifted in their direction. Anne's eyes, sharp and unyielding, flicked briefly toward her brother, and she gave the faintest of nods. It was almost imperceptible, yet it carried volumes. It was as though she had been expecting this outcome, had braced herself for it, and now offered him a silent seal of approval. Anne had always been the enforcer of duty, the one who understood the harsh necessity of decisions others could not bear to make. Her nod did not console Charles. It confirmed to him that what he had done was not just right, but inevitable. Camilla, however, could not remain silent. Her voice cracked with desperation as she protested, her words tumbling out in disbelief and anger. She accused him of betrayal, of humiliation, of tearing apart the marriage they had fought to defend before the world. Her protests echoed through the chamber, but Charles's tone, steady and unwavering, cut her off with brutal efficiency. For every word she hurled at him, his response was colder, sharper, and final. His decision was not up for debate. Her crown was gone, her title dissolved, and her place in history was being rewritten before her eyes. In that moment, the balance of power shifted irreversibly. What had been whispered in shadows, hinted at in rumors, now became reality. The king had stripped his queen of her crown, not in private silence, but before the very family that had doubted her from the beginning. The air was thick with disbelief, yet beneath it ran the current of inevitability. This was no accident, no rash decision. It was the climax of years of tension, betrayal, and secrets finally laid bare. But even as Camilla's title was stripped away, the fallout was only just beginning. As the dust settled, two figures emerged stronger than ever. William and Catherine, who had played the game of silence so masterfully that the crown itself shifted toward them. While the confrontation between Charles and Camilla had stolen the breath from the room, what lingered afterward was not just the shock of a queen being dethroned, but the quiet realization that William and Catherine had been standing in the shadows, waiting for this exact moment. They had not shouted, nor demanded, nor stirred the pot openly, but through patience, precision, and timing, they had ensured that when Camilla fell, the crown's weight would slide naturally toward their side of the family. William's role in this silent maneuver was far more intricate than the calm expression he wore during the confrontation suggested. Behind closed doors, he had long been pressing his father with subtle words, urging him to consider the public's growing resentment and the danger it posed to the monarchy's survival. He never forced, never demanded outright, but carefully seeded doubts and arguments at moments when Charles's guard was lowest. It was not manipulation, it was strategy. William understood his father's deep sensitivity to public opinion and used it as leverage, gently steering him toward the unthinkable decision. What looked like Charles's spontaneous moment of authority was, in truth, the result of William's steady pressure behind the scenes. Catherine's role was even more delicate, yet no less powerful. With quiet diplomacy, she worked through palace staff and trusted allies. Strengthening relationships and ensuring loyalty rested firmly with her and William. She did not speak against Camilla directly. Doing so would have been reckless. Instead, she built an image of steadiness, compassion, and grace that contrasted with Camilla's increasingly embattled presence. In the eyes of the staff who mattered most, Catherine was not just the Princess of Wales. She was the inevitable future, the queen in waiting, who would carry the monarchy with dignity into a new era. Every smile, every act of kindness, every gesture of restraint became another brick in the foundation of her unshakable position. Beyond the palace walls, Catherine's image had begun to eclipse Camilla's entirely. The public saw her not only as the face of modern royalty, but as the symbolic new Diana. It was not that she imitated Diana, but rather that she embodied the same qualities the people yearned for: compassion, grace under pressure, and an unshakable devotion to duty. The media fanned the comparison relentlessly, placing Catherine's warmth and elegance against Camilla's missteps. In every contrast, Catherine came out stronger until the narrative of her as the natural heir to Diana's mantle was unavoidable. For Charles, this was not only reassuring, but essential. By elevating Catherine, he was healing wounds that had festered for decades. Princess Anne, always cautious, always rooted in duty, found herself quietly aligning with William and Catherine as well. She recognized in them the discipline and restraint necessary to preserve the monarchy in perilous times. Though she rarely offered words of praise, her support came in subtler ways. A nod at the right moment, a willingness to back their initiatives, a refusal to defend Camilla when the walls began to close in. Her silent approval only reinforced the shifting balance of power. The public and the press quickly interpreted Charles's act of stripping Camilla's title as more than punishment. It was seen as protection for Catherine's future role as queen, protection for William's eventual reign, protection for the monarchy itself. The people who had grown weary of scandal now saw Charles's move as a safeguard, an act of paternal sacrifice to ensure that the next generation would inherit a crown untarnished by controversy. In this narrative, William and Catherine were not merely passive beneficiaries. They were the rightful heirs, elevated above the storm. By the time the dust fully settled, the shift of power was undeniable. Camilla's circle had been dismantled, her influence erased in a single stroke, and the loyalty of both palace and public had gravitated toward William and Catherine. They did not need to raise their voices or strike openly. Their silence had been their greatest weapon, and it had won them everything. But for Camilla, this wasn't just about power slipping away. It was about humiliation, and her response would shock everyone. Stripped of her title, Camilla didn't bow her head in defeat. Instead, she prepared to fight back, threatening to unleash secrets that could burn the monarchy to the ground. For a moment, the room remained frozen in disbelief, the weight of Charles's decision still heavy in the air. But then came the sound no one expected. Camilla's voice breaking the silence with a cry not of surrender, but of fury. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not born of sorrow alone. They carried the venom of betrayal. She accused Charles of humiliating her in the cruelest way possible in front of the very family who had doubted her from the beginning. Her words trembled with pain, yet behind them was the edge of a threat, sharp enough to cut through the crown itself. Through shaking breaths, Camilla declared that she knew too much and would not go quietly. Her tone shifted from heartbreak to menace as she reminded the family that decades of conversations, letters, and whispered confidences had passed through her hands. She had been more than a consort. She had been a keeper of secrets. And now she made it clear that those secrets would not remain buried if she was cast aside. The implication was devastating. Every royal in the room understood the magnitude of what she was saying. Camilla was not threatening scandal for herself. She was threatening to drag the entire institution down with her. The mention of private letters sent a shiver across the table. There were rumors, always rumors, of communications between Charles and others during the darkest periods of his marriage, of notes exchanged in moments of weakness, of sensitive conversations recorded and stored away. If Camilla possessed even fragments of these, and if she were willing to release them, the monarchy's carefully constructed facade could crumble overnight. She claimed to hold conversations that would reveal the inner fractures of the family, the conflicts hidden from the public eye, and documents that could destroy the trust between crown and country. The royal family sat in stunned silence, unable to interrupt her outburst. Charles himself, though outwardly composed, was shaken by the venom in her words. William's gaze darkened, Catherine's stillness sharpened, and Anne's face hardened as if carved from stone. None dared answer, for every word Camilla spoke raised the stakes higher. Her fury had broken the rules of royal decorum, and in doing so, she had shifted the confrontation into dangerous territory. The monarchy had always survived in secrecy. Camilla was threatening to turn those secrets into weapons. The fear was no longer about losing her title. It was about what she might reveal. What exactly did she mean when she claimed to know too much? Could she truly follow through? Or was it the desperate bluff of a woman who had lost everything? That uncertainty was the most terrifying part. For in the world of royalty, perception mattered as much as truth. Even the suggestion of betrayal, even the whisper of scandal, could fracture the fragile trust of a nation already wary of palace intrigue. The tension was unbearable. The line between loyalty and treachery blurred before their eyes. Camilla's words were more than defiance. They were the promise of war. And as Camilla stormed out, one thing became clear. The royal family was entering a new chapter, defined not by unity, but by war. With the monarchy teetering, advisors scrambled to contain the firestorm Charles had unleashed, knowing one wrong move could destroy the crown forever. The moment the private meeting ended, the palace erupted into chaos. Doors closed, phones rang endlessly, and senior staff huddled in hushed conversations as the magnitude of what had just occurred settled in. The king's decision had been absolute, but its implications were volatile. What had begun as a family confrontation was now on the brink of becoming an international crisis. Advisors knew that if the news slipped on uncontrolled, the monarchy's fragile hold on public trust could collapse overnight. Within hours, immediate briefings were called. The most trusted aides gathered in private rooms, their voices sharp with urgency. The central question was simple yet perilous. Should the palace deny what had taken place, attempt to spin it, or confirm it outright? Each option carried grave risks. A denial would crumble the moment Camilla chose to speak, and everyone understood she would not remain silent for long. Spinning it as a minor correction of protocol risked insulting the intelligence of a public already restless. Confirmation, however, would be unprecedented. A sitting monarch publicly stripping his wife of her title, with all the humiliation and division that such an act would invite. The weight of that choice pressed heavily on every advisor in the room. Fear of Camilla's next move only deepened the panic. She had stormed out with threats still echoing, her words promising revelations that could tear the monarchy from within. The possibility that she might hand private letters, conversations, or documents to the press was no longer dismissed as idle rage. It was a clear and present danger. Advisors whispered of scenarios in which newspapers splashed intimate royal secrets across their front pages. Secrets that could not be contained once they escaped the palace gates. The monarchy had weathered scandals before, but the prospect of betrayal from within the royal household itself was unprecedented. This was not a distant enemy. It was a crown torn apart by its own hand. In the midst of this storm, William's voice cut through the noise. Calm, yet resolute. He insisted the narrative must be reframed, not as a family fracture, but as an act of unity and renewal. To him, Charles's decision had to be painted as a courageous step to protect the monarchy's future, to safeguard Catherine's role, and to restore faith in the crown. Anything less would look like weakness. William's conviction was unshakable, and though some advisors hesitated, the logic was undeniable. Survival depended on controlling the story, not avoiding it. Catherine Mischwein, meanwhile, became the palace's most powerful weapon. With quiet dignity, she agreed to appear publicly, her presence intended to reassure a nation that was watching in shock. She said little, but her composure spoke volumes. Where Camilla's downfall represented chaos, Catherine embodied calm. The contrast could not have been more stark. And palace strategists knew that every photograph, every image of her grace would anchor the monarchy's credibility at a time when words might fail. She was not just supporting her husband. She was steadying the institution itself. And in the shadows, whispers grew of Anne's steadfast loyalty to Charles. Though she remained silent in public, staff close to the family suggested she had privately reinforced her brother's resolve, reminding him that leadership demanded hard choices, no matter how painful. Her support mattered more than many realized. Anne, the figure of unyielding duty, lent Charles the strength to hold firm, even as the palace descended into chaos. Yet, even as advisors crafted statements and prepared for the storm, there was an unshakable truth no spin could erase. The monarchy had crossed a line from which it could never return. Camilla's title was gone. The family was fractured, and the institution stood on fragile ground. No matter how carefully words were chosen, the damage had been done, and the crown would never look the same again. But beyond spin and statements, one truth remained. The monarchy had been forever changed in a single afternoon.